A quiet night outside a city ATM suddenly turned into chaos when a police K-9 refused to let a man walk away. Every bark grew louder, every second more tense, until one detail slipped from the stranger's jacket that changed everything. What came next left the entire crowd frozen in shock. Here's the full story, but before we roll on, drop "Where in the world are you watching" in the comments and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, what's coming next you won't want to miss. It was late evening when the glow of neon signs reflected off the wet pavement outside a busy city ATM corner. People moved quickly, shielding themselves from the drizzle. Among them was a man who seemed out of place. His jacket was zipped high, his cap pulled low, and his stance rigid as he lingered too long near the cash machine. Passers-by noticed but hurried along, assuming nothing. Yet one pair of eyes did not look away. Those eyes belonged to a trained police K-9, whose instincts were sharper than any human suspicion. The patrol unit had been assigned to routine city surveillance. The K-9, restless but alert, suddenly stiffened when the man stepped closer to the ATM. Without warning, the dog let out a sharp bark that cut through the hum of city traffic. Officers glanced at each other, surprised by the sudden change. The dog was not reacting to random movement. It was fixated. His growls grew deeper, paws planted firmly on the slick pavement, body angled toward the stranger as if refusing to allow him to move forward. At first, the man hardly reacted. He kept his hands tucked inside his jacket, his gaze flicking nervously between the ATM and the surrounding street. To an untrained eye, it could have seemed like ordinary unease. But to officers who had worked with dogs long enough, the tension was undeniable. Dogs rarely alerted without reason, and this was no small reaction. The K-9 would not stop barking, each sound louder, sharper, demanding attention. Questions formed instantly in the minds of those nearby. Why this man? Why here? Why tonight? A few pedestrians slowed their steps, curiosity piqued. Some whispered and pointed. The scene that began as a routine patrol was quickly turning into something larger. The officers moved with caution. Their training told them that when a K-9 locks onto a target, it is not to be dismissed. Still, uncertainty lingered. Was the man armed? Was he hiding something dangerous? Or was this just a misunderstanding magnified by the dog's heightened senses? Suspense hung in the cool night air, thick enough that even the bystanders felt it. One officer signaled subtly, and the K-9 was guided closer. The dog's behavior intensified. Bark after bark echoed against the buildings, drawing even more onlookers. The man shifted his stance, pressing back slightly, as though he wanted to step away, but found himself unable to move. The crowd's eyes burned into him now. Something was wrong, but nobody could say what. The man finally raised his head, his expression a mix of strain and unease. His clothes, though ordinary, were damp as if he had been outside for far longer than necessary. His shoes were muddy, out of place for city streets. And tucked just under his jacket, something bulged awkwardly, as though he carried more than simple belongings. That detail did not escape the trained eyes of the officers, nor the sharpened instincts of the K-9. Another bark, another growl, another reason for hearts to pound. The suspense grew thicker. What was in the man's jacket? Why did he linger here instead of withdrawing money and leaving? Why had the K-9 chosen this exact moment, out of hundreds of ordinary patrol nights, to sound such an alarm? The drizzle turned to a steadier rain, streaking the ATM screen with droplets. The glow of headlights reflected in puddles, adding a cinematic edge to the tension. Officers kept their distance but widened their stance, forming a cautious semicircle. The crowd, sensing something important was unfolding, stayed frozen at the edges, whispering quietly but unwilling to leave. The man shifted again, his breathing shallow, his posture unsteady. He seemed torn between flight and surrender, yet he made no move. The K-9, however, had already decided for him. The dog lunged forward slightly, restrained only by the strong grip of his handler, teeth bared but controlled. His warning was clear. This was not a man to be ignored. The atmosphere was electric with unanswered questions, And then came the first unexpected detail, the kind that builds a chain of dots not yet connected. As the man adjusted his jacket, something slipped slightly from the fold of fabric, a thin edge of plastic smeared with dirt. It was not money, it was not a phone, it was something else entirely. The officers caught it instantly. The K9 barked louder. The crowd leaned closer, though none dared step forward. Suspicion deepened, but just as quickly as the detail appeared, the man pressed it back into place and lowered his head again, as if hiding not just an object but an entire truth. That single glimpse set off a storm of silent speculation. Was it a weapon? A stolen card reader? Something more sinister? The questions churned faster than answers could form, and the officers felt their pulse quicken. Yet the K9 did not waver. His stance remained fierce, his gaze unblinking, as though he alone already knew the truth. The man finally took a half step back, shoes splashing in the puddles. But the K9 barked again, louder than before, the sound ricocheting against glass windows. Every head turned. The stranger was no longer just a man at an ATM. He was the center of something hidden, something heavy, something dangerous enough for a trained dog to refuse to let go. The dots were beginning to line up, but no one yet saw the full picture. It all closed with tension unbroken, questions unresolved, and curiosity pulled tighter than ever. Something about the man, his presence, and the object under his jacket held the key to everything. The crowd remained frozen, the officers locked in caution, and the K9 relentless in his pursuit. Whatever the truth was, it was waiting to surface. The rain fell harder now, trickling down coats and pooling in the cracks of the pavement, but no one moved from the scene. Something about the stranger's silence made the air feel heavier. His shoulders hunched, his eyes darted from side to side, and still his hands stayed buried inside the folds of his jacket. Every movement was small, but each one carried meaning. The K9 knew it first, his body tense and unrelenting, barking in sharp bursts that echoed into the night. The crowd grew wider yet quieter. Whispers spread among the bystanders, each person inventing their own explanation for what was happening. Some suspected theft, others whispered about weapons. But deep down, everyone felt the same nagging question: why had this man chosen this place at this time with this stance? Officers tightened their formation. The bulge beneath the jacket replayed in their minds, as did the glimpse of that plastic edge. The K9 pressed forward again, claws scraping against wet concrete, muscles pulling with ferocity. This was not a false alarm. There was something deeper, something layered, something the crowd had not yet seen. The man finally shifted, his jacket loosening under the weight of water. For the briefest second, another object slipped into view. This time it was unmistakable. It was a sealed envelope, thick and creased, stuffed as though it contained more than paper. Mud stains ran across its surface. The detail sent shivers down spines. It was not a wallet, not an ordinary letter. The envelope looked weathered, as though it had been buried or hidden somewhere before it landed here at the ATM. Why carry such a thing? Why guard it so closely? Why linger in the rain instead of walking away? The dog barked louder still, the sound commanding absolute attention. The envelope was not random. Officers exchanged glances, silent but knowing. This was no ordinary case. But before anyone could act, the man shifted once again, pressing his back against the ATM's frame, as if protecting what he carried. His face, tired and strained, showed not anger but desperation, a look that was harder to read and more unsettling than open hostility. The suspense pressed tighter. Was this man a criminal hiding contraband? A courier smuggling something forbidden? Or someone clutching onto a secret no one else yet understood? The crowd's murmurs swelled, eyes glued to the scene as though they were part of a slow-building storm. Raindrops glistened under streetlights, flashing like sparks as if nature itself wanted to highlight the unfolding mystery. The K9, restless, pulled toward the man once more, but the handler's firm grip held him back. Still, the growls continued, sharp and guttural, declaring what everyone already sensed. This man carried something that mattered, And then came another clue, one no one expected. As the man adjusted his footing, something clattered against the ground. It was small, metallic, and oddly shaped. It rolled briefly before stopping against the curb. An officer's flashlight beam caught it, and the sight made everyone stiffen. It was a key, not an ordinary house key, but an industrial one, thick, ridged, the type used for storage units or security locks. Scratches lined its surface, and faint dirt clung to its edges. The connection deepened. First the jacket bulge, then the weathered envelope, now the key. 3 pieces of a puzzle no one yet understood, but all of them tied together. The man noticed the officers looking at it. His breathing grew heavier. He pressed harder against the ATM, clutching his jacket tighter, as though he knew the pieces were falling into view faster than he could control. The canine barked in rhythm, every sound a demand for action. By now the rain had thinned the crowd, but those who remained stood frozen in fascination, unwilling to leave until the mystery revealed itself. Every detail was like a thread pulling tighter, each moment edging closer to revelation. One officer stepped cautiously toward the fallen key, but the man shifted sharply, as though warning them away. His reaction was enough to confirm suspicion. The key was important, not to be touched, not to be claimed. Yet it was already in plain sight, already raising questions too heavy to ignore. Where did it belong? What was locked away behind that kind of mechanism? And why was it connected to the envelope and the bulge under the jacket? The atmosphere carried the weight of a secret about to break open. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The only sound was the steady bark of the canine, echoing against stone walls, bouncing off windows, commanding the focus of everyone in range. The officers tightened their circle slightly, cautious but unyielding. The stranger's options dwindled, his body language betraying his strain. And then, just when the tension seemed unbearable, the man did something unexpected. He slowly lowered himself to the wet ground, knees pressing into the pavement. His jacket shifted, and the envelope slipped free, tumbling into the puddles. Water seeped into the edges, darkening the paper, but still the contents stayed sealed. The canine froze, ears perked, eyes locked not on the man but on the envelope. He barked once more, sharp and singular, then stood in silence as if declaring that this, not the man, was the true focus. The crowd gasped, drawn closer by the sudden shift. The envelope, the key, the jacket bulge, they were pieces of one story, one hidden truth waiting to be revealed. An officer bent carefully, retrieving the soaked envelope. Its weight surprised him. Inside, something pressed against the folds, rigid and unmistakably solid. It was not money. It was not papers alone. It was something else, something that belonged with the industrial key. But what? The man still did not speak. He sat slumped against the ATM, breathing hard, jacket clinging to him under the rain. His silence was its own confession, yet no one could interpret it fully. The canine, however, had no hesitation. His gaze never wavered, his alert stance unbroken. The dog had led them here for a reason, and every detail discovered only proved it further. As officers inspected the envelope and gathered the fallen key, the man slowly leaned his head back against the wall, as though waiting for the inevitable. His eyes closed briefly, not in rest but in resignation. The mystery had not yet reached its breaking point, but the dots were forming faster now. The key, the envelope, the hidden object in the jacket, all tied to the man who had lingered at an ATM, drawing suspicion only because a canine had trusted his instincts. Whatever truth lay inside that envelope and wherever the key belonged, it was clear the answer would stun not only the officers but everyone who had watched the night unfold. The canine stood tall, his presence unwavering. The crowd, though drenched, stayed frozen. The officers tightened their grip on the evidence. And the man, silent and still, held the final piece of a puzzle no one yet understood. The revelation was near, but it had not yet come. The man slumped against the wall as the rain finally eased into a mist. The crowd had thinned, but those who remained stood locked in silence, watching as the pieces of mystery hung in the balance. The canine had quieted now, but his stance was still rigid, his eyes burning into the jacket that concealed the last clue. The envelope lay in an officer's hand, soaked and heavy, while the industrial key rested in another. Every detail pointed to something larger than coincidence. Still, the final truth lay hidden, guarded by a man who had yet to move or speak. The officers edged closer, cautious but determined. The K-9 gave a low growl, urging them forward. The bulge inside the jacket had to be revealed. Slowly, carefully, the officers unzipped the damp fabric. Inside was not a weapon, not cash, not drugs. Instead, wrapped in plastic and secured with layers of tape, was a small metal box, its corners rusted, its sides scarred as though it had been buried for years. The crowd gasped. The K-9 barked once, sharp and decisive, as though declaring the discovery complete. The box, though small, carried a weight far beyond its size. Mud streaks lined its surface, confirming what the envelope had already suggested. This had been hidden underground, unearthed only recently. The key, heavy and industrial, fit perfectly into the lock embedded in its face. The connection was undeniable. The envelope, the key, the box, 3 dots now linked in one straight line. But what was inside? The officers turned the key carefully, every click echoing in the tense night. The crowd leaned in. The man pressed his head into his arms, his body trembling under the weight of exposure. And then, with a metallic snap, the box unlocked. The lid opened slowly. Inside were bundles of folded papers, sealed photographs, and a small velvet pouch. The contents were protected, though the years had stained their edges. One officer lifted the pouch and opened it gently. Inside lay a collection of military medals, tarnished but still gleaming faintly beneath the streetlights. The discovery struck everyone at once. The man was not clutching stolen goods or criminal evidence. He was clutching fragments of a life once lived. Someone's service, someone's history, someone's sacrifice. The photographs, though faded, showed a young soldier in uniform smiling beside family. The papers included old letters, service records, and documents with creased edges but undeniable importance. The K-9, who had drawn everyone here, stood tall beside the scene. His instinct had been right, but the truth was different than anyone expected. The officers paused, piecing it together. Why hide such items? Why bury them and then risk exposure by retrieving them at night? The answer arrived not in words, but in the man's trembling frame. His silence, his desperation, his refusal to let go, it all carried meaning. He was not a thief. He was a guardian of something fragile. One officer studied the documents closer. Among them was a discharge certificate issued decades ago belonging to a soldier who had long since passed. The name matched the photographs, and the letters inside revealed a story of a family broken apart by loss. The medals were all that remained of his service. The realization spread like a wave. The man had not come to the ATM for money. He had come here with nowhere else to go, carrying pieces of a life that had been left behind, pieces he could not bear to part with. Perhaps the items had been found buried on old property, perhaps they had been unearthed by chance. But in his hands they were more than objects. They were his connection to someone who had mattered deeply. The crowd, once tense and suspicious, now softened. Whispers turned from fear to sorrow. The officers, too, understood. The K-9, though trained to detect threat, had led them instead to a deeper truth, one of memory, loyalty, and loss. The man finally lifted his head. His eyes, red and weary, locked onto the box. His silence carried weight heavier than words. The officers did not need an explanation. The story was written in the medals, in the faces of the photographs, in the faded ink of the letters. And then came the most unexpected moment of all. From within the stack of documents, an officer pulled free a smaller envelope tucked into the folds. Inside was a note written in careful, aged handwriting. The message was simple. To whoever finds this, please remember me not as I was lost, but as I lived. These are the pieces of my story. Keep them safe. The words silenced everyone. The officers stood frozen, the crowd stunned, the man trembling, the K-9 watching with steady eyes. What had begun as suspicion outside an ATM had transformed into the recovery of a legacy nearly forgotten. The officers closed the box carefully, sealing the treasures inside once more. They did not treat the man as a suspect. Instead, they helped him rise, his hands still clutching the envelope as though it were his lifeline. The medals and photographs were preserved, the story now shared rather than hidden. The K9 wagged his tail faintly, his work complete. His instincts had unearthed not crime but truth. The night, once filled with tension, now carried a different weight. The crowd dispersed slowly, their whispers softer, their steps gentler. Touched by the scene they had witnessed, the officers guided the man with care, no longer as a stranger under suspicion, but as someone who had protected something precious. The dots connected at last, the bulge, the envelope, the key, the box. Each piece led to the next, and the final picture was not one of guilt but of remembrance. The mystery had been solved. The crowd that once stood frozen now walked away changed, and the K9 who had carried the story on his sharp instincts stood proud beside his handler, having once again proven that sometimes what lies beneath suspicion is a truth worth saving. The ending, though born of suspense, carried peace. The legacy was safe, the man was understood, and the night closed not in fear but in resolution. If that story kept you on the edge of your seat, just wait until you see what's coming next. Don't miss out. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you're the first to uncover the next mystery. And if you enjoyed this one, a quick like goes a long way in helping us bring you even more incredible K9 stories.